Good morning, everybody. Good to be with you. It'd be great if you could have that passage that the girls read to us open from John chapter 21. Well, I don't know how you felt about the year that's just gone, 2023. I don't know how that was for you. I'm going to suggest one of the best ways to go into the new year, and this is like the first normal Sunday of the new year, isn't it? One of the best ways to head into 2024 is by dealing with our failures from 2023. Now the message does get more upbeat, don't worry. But I think that's what this passage is about, isn't it? Most of us actually live with some sense of failure. Perhaps life hasn't turned out exactly as we hoped when we were in our 20s. Perhaps you may be in a situation when you feel that the life you have at the moment is kind of second best. Not many of you, but a few of you may be in that kind of middle-age phase. You know, that phase where you hoped you would rise higher, but you realise this probably is it. Over Christmas, we spent time with family. Reminds us of some good things, perhaps some difficult things. Some of us will have regrets as parents. Our kids are not walking with the Lord as we hoped. And we wonder whether that had something to do with us. We feel some sense of failure. Some of us have marriages that failed, and we still feel that that's part of us. Some of us are in marriages that haven't failed officially, but they feel unsatisfactory. Now, if I haven't covered you in that list, hey, some of that is not our fault, is it? Some of that is just life. Some of it is partly our fault, and some of it was our fault, and we carry a sense of failure. Perhaps for some of us, there was a phase where we were all over the place. It's embarrassing when we meet people who know us from that phase. And even today, we're still living with the side effects of what we were then. For me, sometimes I look back, you're just driving, just starting to relax, and stupid things you said in the past, and your head just wasn't quite in the right place, and it caused knock-on effects for people. And you think, what was I thinking? And as we get older, often our minds just run through our past lives, don't they? Perhaps we're less active in the drama of life today, and our minds just review what's happened in the past. And isn't it annoying that so often it's not the good things that we remember, but the things that went wrong? And we're left with a sense of regret. Well, God's word speaks right into that, and I hope God will speak to us about that this morning. If you look at John's Gospel, if you've got it open in front of you, it looks like John has finished at the end of chapter 20. In fact, he seems to close it off. He says, there's so much I could have told you about all the things that Jesus did, but what I've told you, I've done so that you might believe. Job done. But then he writes another chapter. It seems that he thought again and added another chapter. Partly he added another chapter because in verse 23 there was this rumor going round about John from something Jesus had said, sort of Chinese whispers that had been misunderstood, and he just wants to knock that on the head. But most of the chapter that he adds is actually about how Jesus deals with Peter. And the reason we need that is because if John's Gospel had finished at chapter 20, Peter has been left on a note of terrible failure. So the very last episode of John's Gospel is about how Jesus meets us in our failure. How Jesus met Peter in his failure, so that the disciple who notoriously failed Jesus became the great leader of the church in the book of Acts. And first of all, the first thing that happens here is Jesus wants us, I think, to face up to our failure. I reckon Peter was a really sort of charismatic, engaging guy, don't you? Seems to be the most enthusiastic, full of energy of all Jesus' disciples. Seems like Peter was the enthusiastic follower. But as Jesus approaches the end of his life, he starts to warn his disciples and say, I'm going to be handed over to the Gentiles and crucified, and all of you will fall away. They will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. And Peter says, not me, Jesus. Not me, Jesus. Even if the rest fall away, even if everyone else does, I won't fall away. In fact, even if I have to die, I will stick with you. And as the end comes, Jesus is arrested. And you can already see that Jesus and Peter are on slightly different pages. Jesus is submitting to the arrest. He is going with the process. Peter is fighting it. He cuts off one of the servant's ears. Trying to be courageous. But the time coming as Jesus faces his end, the hour of darkness is going to take more than the physical courage that Peter has. It's the time when the evil one is closing in. And Peter, as Jesus is taken away, trying to warm himself around a fire, 3 times Peter is asked, hey, you're from Galilee, aren't you? You've got the same accent. You're one of his followers, aren't you? Peter says, no, not me. I don't even know the guy. 3 times he's asked. The last time he's so emphatic, he starts swearing about it. Now, we've all said the wrong thing once, haven't we? A momentary lapse, and then we kick ourselves. Or our wives kick us. And we think, oh. But 3 times, with gaps in between. Now, Peter meant this. Never mind dying for Jesus. Never mind being the one that sticks with him to the end. Peter fails even to identify with Jesus in order to save his own skin. How shameful is that? It's a terrible failure. I suppose when I talk about failure, I mean more than sin. More than your day-to-day sins and mistakes. I mean something that feels more catastrophic, that has more ramifications. But the thing about failure is our failures are actually a really important pathway to growth. Because what failures do is they express fault lines in our hearts and our lives that are actually there. You see, Peter's self-assessment is, look at all the disciples. How does Peter see himself as a follower of Jesus? Slightly more committed than the others. That they might fall away, not me. Slightly more courageous than the others. Peter's identity as a follower of Jesus is based on comparison with other followers of Jesus, rather than being completely rooted in Christ. And that's why when Jesus warns them that they're going to fall away, it doesn't register with Peter, because his self-identity is, no, I'm the committed one who will never fall away. He just doesn't hear it. And his failure exposes that weakness in the way he sees himself. All the disciples fall away, don't they? Peter falls harder and he falls further because it exposes the weakness in his identity. So as we come into the chapter 21 that was read to us, initially it kind of feels like we're back the way things used to be. It's a miraculous catch of fish. There's Jesus. There's Peter, the man of action, right to the fore. Kind of, let's just get back to normal. Which is what we want to do after we fail, don't we? We don't want to dwell on it and think about it. We want to just bounce back. But before Peter gets back to normal, he needs to get back to Jesus in his heart. And that's what we see from verse 15. Notice how it's emphasized. Here we are again at a beach. I don't know about you, but beaches are one of those places that really evoke memories for me. Hot days, childhood holidays, very evocative, aren't they, beaches? Well, Peter was called to Jesus on a beach, and here he is again on a beach, and he's going to be recommissioned by Jesus. But Jesus wants him to face a few things first. So here they are, and they see Jesus, and he's round a fire. What does that remind you of? It was around a fire, of course, where Peter denied Jesus. And then Jesus takes Peter for a one-to-one. Takes him on a walk for a serious chat. And do you notice how what he calls him? He doesn't call him Peter. What does he call him? Simon, son of Jonah. Well, he always used to call him Peter. But Peter was the name given him by Jesus. Rock. Peter was what he will become as he walks with Jesus. But that's not what he's been doing, is it? He calls him Simon, son of Jonah, because what he's been in denying Jesus is what he is when he lives in his own strength. And then there's this question repeated. Do you love me more than these? Peter, really? Really, do you love me more than the other disciples? Peter, when you look in the mirror at night, are you going to be that person whose identity is based on comparison? I'm a little better than them. How did that go for you, mate? And imagine at this point, as Jesus asked him this question, Peter's starting to feel very shifty. He doesn't want to look him in the eye. Suddenly his sandals seem fascinating. I mean, we don't like to face this stuff, do we? It's painful. We want to move on. But Jesus wants him to face it. And so he asks him 3 times the same question. Peter, do you really love me more than these? And when he asks him for the 3rd time, Peter can't hold it off anymore because he denied him 3 times. And it all comes flooding back and says Peter is hurt by Jesus' question. This morning, perhaps the last thing you want to do is to dwell on last year's failures. Perhaps you just want to move on like Peter did, move on to activity, or being an FIC church, to being right. It's what we do well. But that would be a mistake. Failure is really important in our lives because it reveals things about us that we would miss otherwise. And it's really important that we bring our failure to Jesus, because what Christ is doing here, though it's painful, is he's doing surgery on Peter's heart. He's probing like a surgeon who wants to heal him and redirect him. And we need that, don't we? So as we enter 2024, I think it's a really good thing to pause. It's really obvious to me as I think about last year. There's 2 things that stand out where I really failed. And perhaps for you. And to pause and to let Jesus probe our hearts about what was going on with those things. Church life isn't always easy, is it? I think when we disagree in church, it's very easy to fall into this identity by comparison. So I don't agree with these people over there. Do you know why that is? They don't care about the truth like I do. I mean, they're not as well taught as me, obviously, and they haven't read the books that I've read, and they really don't care about the truth like I do. And our identity as a follower of Christ, as a member of Stoke Evangelical Church, becomes a matter of comparison. Or they don't care about people like I do. That's why they're so rigid. And sometimes we say harsh things, and it exposes the fault lines in our heart. Jesus wants us to face our failure because God has grace for failures. God has grace for all our failures. And Jesus wants to redirect your heart. But it's not a cheap grace. It's not an easy grace. It's one that deals with reality. So that's the first thing. Jesus gets Peter to face his failure. I'm quite confused by starting at 10:15, trying to work out how long I've been speaking. Facing our failure. But then, secondly, Peter is restored by Jesus. I think one of the fears around today is that if you make certain mistakes, there can be no way back. Perhaps you said something slightly racist when you were younger, or you made some sort of homophobic slur, or said something that could be considered misogynistic. And the fear I think younger people have in particular is if that comes out, that they will be forever labelled and cancelled, and there will be no way back for them. And who didn't say stupid things when they were younger? And especially with social media, it's out there somewhere. But with Jesus Christ, whatever your failure, there is always a way back. Peter thought he was so committed to Jesus that he would die for him if necessary. And when it came to it, he completely bottled it. Peter didn't die for Jesus. He didn't even admit that he knew him. But Jesus did die for Peter. Jesus went all the way. Jesus said, I know Peter has sinned, but don't punish Peter. Punish me. Don't do it to him. Do it to me. And when Jesus died, he died for all Peter's cowardice and pride and fake righteousness. And it was all covered and paid for by the death of Jesus. So as the risen Jesus comes to encounter Peter, he comes now offering grace for his failure. There is always a way back with Jesus. However you failed and however embarrassing and humiliating that was, there is always a way back because Jesus has died and covered that sin, and he comes offering you his grace. And you see how Peter responds. This is how you receive his grace. He just puts himself in his hands and lets Jesus redirect him. 3 times he asks him. It's obvious what Jesus is doing, and Peter feels hurt and humiliated. But he doesn't say, hang on a minute, Lord. You're focusing on the negative here. What about all the good things I did? Or, man, that was an intense time. I mean, everybody fell away. We all struggled. There's none of that. Peter just says, Lord, you know. You know. And he does, doesn't he? He sees our hearts. He knows the whole thing. I don't know why we try and pretend, because he sees the reality. And Peter just puts himself in Jesus' hands. All that overconfidence, all that comparison is gone. It's just Peter as he is before the Lord. And that is a really safe place to be. I know it feels painful. We don't like to expose ourselves. But that is a really safe place to be. Because of the Lord's love and acceptance for us, because our sins are forgiven, and because he wants to deal with us and redirect our hearts to better paths. Lord, you know. And yes, the Lord does know that however much Peter had an overinflated view of his love for Jesus, he does genuinely love him. And so Peter is restored to Jesus. And here's the grace. Despite the seriousness of what Peter did, and in those cultures, loyalty was a really, really strong thing. What Peter did was really shameful. There's no groveling required. There's no kind of probationary period like you'd get at work. All right, well, we'll just have to see how you go before we trust you again. Immediately, Peter puts himself in Jesus' hands and accepts what Jesus is saying and humbles himself. He is commissioned to this really key role in God's kingdom. When you face your failure, then Jesus restores you. The really great thing is that our failures need not be crippling. God can restore to you the years that have been wasted, the things that have been squandered. I know some of us may still live with consequences in our lives of what's happened, but the great thing about the grace of God is they do not determine today and our future. God's grace does. And if we choose to cover over because it's all too excruciating, and that's our personality, we just like to sweep things under the carpet and try and move on, we don't experience God's grace in our failure like Peter does. And deep within, we're left with that sense of maybe, if only I hadn't. That kind of self-flagellation as we get older and think about what we've done. And those regrets. The Bible talks about a godly sorrow that leaves no regret. And that involves facing our failure and receiving Jesus' grace for our failure. So the great thing is that last year's failures can become the springboard for this year's growth. Last year's failures expose things in your heart and life that needed exposing. But as you allow Jesus to probe those and allow him to deal with you, Christ will change your heart and redirect you. Last thing we see is that Peter is recommissioned to serve. But because Peter has humbled himself, because he has received Jesus' correction, Peter is now ready to be commissioned to a new role. He's ready for spiritual leadership. Can you think how disastrous it would be if he hadn't been through that process? If he fell into spiritual leadership, but he was still using it to be someone. If he still had this thing that I'm kind of better than the others. All kinds of problems in leadership from that kind of attitude. No. Peter is now realistic about himself. He is humbled. He knows his own weakness. And that's how we serve Christ. Christ doesn't call you to serve him because you're so great. He calls you to serve him out of your weakness and through what he is doing in you. And as we think about serving Christ in the new year, I think this is relevant to all of us, whatever our role, however it is that you serve Christ. These last two chapters in John, we get John's account of Jesus' resurrection appearances. And John makes a point that Jesus Jesus was raised on the first day of the week. It was something that happened in history, but now something new has been started. There is a new spiritual life. There is a new kingdom that Jesus is bringing in. This is what it looks like. And what it looks like, what it runs on, is love. Peter, do you really love me more than these? Lord, you know that I love you. Well then, care for my sheep. Look after my sheep. Jesus says, so you love me, Peter? I know you do. Love me, love my sheep. What we do when we serve Christ, whatever your role here, or perhaps you do Christian work outside of the church, that is not just a job that you do. You're not just filling a slot on a rota. The purpose of that is to love God's people. You play a role so that God's people will flourish and can do things. Or you play a role so that God's sheep who haven't yet come to know him, come to know him. Whatever we do in service for God runs on love. And that's how you experience the resurrection life that Jesus brings. When you love something, you really know it. So Peter is told, care for my sheep. You think, we think, oh, that's great for Sunday school, sheep, and sheep are lovely. It's a beautiful pastoral image, looking after sheep. Let me tell you, as a pastor, the sheep are not always lovely. Let's be honest. Some of the sheep are very immature. Some of them are downright cantankerous. Some of them will treat you badly when you're trying to look after them. Some of them, sadly, it seems, make no apparent spiritual progress year after year. Nevertheless, Jesus says, tend my sheep. Tend my sheep. It's a really gentle word. Whatever they're like, Peter, if you love me, love my sheep. Tend them. In other words, Peter is to shepherd God's people just like Jesus has been shepherding him through his failure. He has probed him, he has dealt with him, he has been straight with him, but he is for him, he is restoring him, he is offering him grace. And that is what spiritual leadership looks like in God's kingdom. The more we're involved in leadership, the more important it is that we have those qualities of loving the sheep. I could go off on one here about what to look for in a pastor, but I think that would take us down a side alley. But it's relevant, isn't it? You don't just preach sermons into a vacuum. You preach sermons to a particular group of God's sheep that you must know and love. And each of us, to some extent, are called to serve in God's kingdom this year if we are one of Christ's people. Now, each of us has our own path in that. Peter is walking along with Jesus, and he sees his mate John walking behind, and he says, well, what about my buddy? What about him? What's going to happen to him? And Jesus says, that's none of your business. That is my business with him. Each of us has different paths, different callings, different gifts that we are to use in Christ's service according to Christ's work in us. Peter was going to become the great preacher in Acts, the leader of the early church. John was going to become the great writer who wrote the kind of deepest sort of gospel. Peter was going to be martyred, as Jesus tells him in a minute. John was going to live on into old age. Each of us has our own path of service that God is calling us to this year and beyond. Jesus says to Peter, don't worry about John. You follow me. You follow me. This is what I'm calling you to. Tend my sheep. Take this leadership role over my people. You follow me wholeheartedly. What he says to Peter about how that's going to go is kind of encouraging and kind of tough. In verse 18, he says, when you are old, you will stretch out your hands. Stretching out your hands is a euphemism for crucifixion. Do you know, Peter, when you're older, as you've walked with me for many years, if you've learned to keep bringing your failure to me and receiving my grace, as you've learned not to try and live out of your own strength and your own perceived abilities, but to live out of Christ's strength, you will gradually be changed. In 30 years' time, the time will come when you'll face the challenge, will you really die for me? And this time you won't save your skin. This time you'll be in a position where I've changed you over the years, and you will do what was in your heart to do. Kind of challenging. It's a tough path. But God will be working in him so that he is able to do it. Follow me. Jesus is calling us, whatever we did in 2023, to serve him wholeheartedly. I don't know what your role is in the church. I don't know how your gifts are used here. If you're not sure of that, that's a really good thing to discuss with the leaders, or when there's capacity for someone to visit you to have that conversation. But whatever it is you do, you're to do out of love for Jesus and out of love for his sheep. And that is how God's resurrection life is manifested amongst us. So through this final story in John's Gospel, God is saying to you this morning, you need to face your failure. You need to come to me and to be restored. And then you will feel my commission for how I want you to serve in 2024. Isn't it encouraging that the last episode in the last gospel is about how Jesus deals with failures? Because the brilliant thing is, God doesn't do his work through superheroes. God does his work through failures. And as you read through the Bible, reading to the letter to Galatians, for instance, this isn't Peter's last public failure. But God uses our failures. God uses failures as we deal with our failure before God. So bring your failure to him. Give the last word to his grace. And out of that grace, let him equip you to serve him in the world. Last verse. So Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. That's a lot to say about human life, but I think if you remember the first verse of the gospel, which I think Phil referred to earlier on, that Jesus was the eternal word, the one who made everything. As John closes off his gospel, he says, think about that. Well, his glory is limitless. If you could put all the books in the world, all the things on the internet, they would not convey all the glory of Jesus, the Son of God. But the point of the chapter, I think, is that as Peter and John play their part, as each of us plays our bit, we play our own part and we will do in 2024 in bringing glory and honour to the Son. And that's an amazing thing, isn't it? Considering that we started thinking about our failure.